So the work that, I should say, the approach that we bring to this matter of reparatory justice is one that is unique and certainly distinctive. We begin first by creating, if you will, a taxonomy of harms, which is distinctive in terms of not merely looking at the chronology of racial harms in this country with respect to African Americans, but the categorization of those harms, the variability and diversity of those harms. Second element that's distinctive in the approach that we are taking is the visualization of the interconnection of these racial harms across the generations, right? So in other words, the harms visited on African Americans and the descendants of American slaves are in fact, they're profound, but they're not freestanding. They relate to one another, they compound over time, and they literally span generations. We also examine the norms for the compensation of harms. We also examine the common and conventional financial restitution programs in this country. So in other words, in this country, we have all manner of programs that engage in the financial restitution of harms, a wide variety of harms, and in a sense, reparations is not an uncommon endeavor in our country. And we collectively incorporate this, or I should say, we are endeavoring to incorporate this approach into the national conversation. Next slide. So we want to be very clear at the outset that the set of harms that we are discussing have been inflicted upon African Americans due to federal policy, actions, inactions, negligence, indirect effects in ways that are quite profound, spanning the arc of time. These actions and inactions, federal policy, negligence, indirect, are a matter of de jure and de facto consequences. These harms, let us note here, are rooted in chattel slavery, but not limited to chattel slavery. So in other words, for those who regard slavery as something as a part of America's distant past, when you look at the racial harms that have grown out of slavery, the convict leasing system manifested in this carceral state in which we find ourselves, voter suppression going back to the days of literally the 15th Amendment. These harms are complex and diverse, rooted in chattel slavery, but not limited. In terms of transformation and evolution, many of these harms are intertwined with other harms compounded over time with long-term intergenerational consequences. This is incredibly important for us to appreciate that in terms of talking about the racial harms that are part of America's past, present, and indeed the future, that these harms are not freestanding. They interact with one another. The effects compound over time in ways that are intergenerational, that can be felt, experienced, measured in people's lives, families, and communities. One part of our work that's critically important, and I think unique, which is that these harms can be visualized through interactive relational software or relationship software, i.e. Kumu. So in other words, we can plot these harms, look at the nodes of these harms in terms of laws, policies, and regulations, and visualize them and show the ways in which they interact with one another, literally compounding the effect of these harms in ways that cross generations. And lastly, and this is really credit to one of our wonderful students, that we can go beyond this visualization software to reduce these harms to a two-dimensional picture that might be visualized as a living tree. And so we'll get to that later, but I think this is a very, very powerful way of looking at the very complex racial harms that have been visited upon African Americans. So if we can go to the next slide. So when we think about a taxonomy of harms, a categorization, a classification of harms, we can think in terms of 7 functional categories: housing, labor, the criminal punishment or the criminal legal system, healthcare, education, violence, and disenfranchisement. Specifically, what we mean by that is voter disenfranchisement. So just by way of example, if we think of African American forebears leaving slavery, literally sleeping in open fields, having to find ways to subsist with their bodies, that is through labor. This whole manner of them being subject to a criminal punishment system, endeavoring to reduce them back to a state of chattel slavery. Healthcare across the ages, demonstrating the precariousness of life and the vulnerability of Black bodies. Education being anything but a right for African Americans, and of course violence being a part of daily life. And when we think about the franchise inscribed in, precariously inscribed in the 15th Amendment, being a civic sacrament that African Americans across the generations have clung to with uncertain effect. So these are 7 functional categories. But let's turn next to the next slide. That really demonstrates the ways in which the racial harms that we have seen and we yet see in this country are not a matter of the distant past and not a matter of freestanding harms, but are in fact related to one another in intergenerational ways. So if we think about the GI Bill, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed in 1944. It provided college tuition, low-cost home loans, unemployment insurance to all veterans who were honorably discharged through 1956. And yet those who fought against fascism and Nazism abroad returned to face Jim Crow at home. That is to say 1.2 million Black veterans of World War II, 8% of the total. These African Americans, these veterans, those who fought for their country, were not able to access the full measure of GI benefits. So when we think about GI benefits in terms of education, very few African Americans were able to attain any of the full measure of such benefits. Almost no Blacks obtained GI home loans. That is to say, in New York, fewer than 100 of 67,000 GI Bill mortgages went to non-whites. That is to say, presumptively speaking, a smaller fraction went to African Americans. But let's look at the ways in which these harms interact. So if the GI Bill was administered by the states, it allowed the states to discriminate. It allowed the state to impose the stamp of Jim Crow on the GI Bill. If we think about the fact that lenders, in terms of lenders engaging in redlining, that is to say the segregation of finance, the segregation of mortgages, the segregation of housing, which prevented Blacks from buying homes, and that is to say using their benefits to have a stake in the American dream. If we think about education, African Americans, that is to say African American GIs, 95% were told to apply to Black colleges only. Well, what that meant was by limiting their options to historically Black colleges and universities, what that meant was not merely that separate was inherently unequal, it meant that separate was inherently and obviously smaller. That is to say, a smaller number of colleges to choose from. And that also meant that where there were HBCUs that were distant from where GIs lived, that meant that they had the option of going, I should say, not attending college or traveling some distance to go to an HBCU, placing a college education beyond their reach. When we think about the fact that most vocational trades were restricted to whites, so in other words, vocational education would not be a means by which GIs could access the American dream in terms of the vocational trades. The ways in which housing, education, training interact in the lives of GIs, in the lives of their families, span generations and show the degree to which these racial harms interact with one another in people's lives in ways that can be fiscally measured, historically chronicled, but also visualized as a matter of data. Incredibly important. So if we can turn to the next slide. What our team endeavored to do was to create a means of visualizing these harms across time, across categories, in ways that demonstrate the ways in which these harms interact with one another. In other words, housing, the franchise, voting, violence. How do these harms interact, and how might we measure the impact, as well as chronicle the history in terms of the categories and in terms of the time. This data visualization, this visualization software is linked to a huge database of laws, policy, regulatory decisions. So this was a very, very significant, massive endeavor. And I'd like to just show you the fruit of our colleagues' work in terms of this short Kumu video. So Yaya, if you would cue that up, that'd be great. Thank you. So in this video, which spans about roughly a minute or so, what you're seeing are various nodes, various aspects of these harms and the ways in which they relate to one another. So in terms of educational decisions relating to education as a right, segregation, access to secondary education, higher education. In the case of the criminal punishment system, the relationship between the 13th Amendment, between the pig laws, the slave laws, as the slave codes, black codes. This demonstrates not only the diversity of the harms, but the complexity of the harms and the interaction of the harms. This is incredibly important and distinctive. Why? Because there is in the literature any number of articles and books that speak to the cost of these harms, that speak to the chronology of these harms across time. But what is significant here is that we're looking at the ways in which the harms interact over time and in people's lives. And as you can see, this is a very, very important work. Okay. All right, so with that said, if we can turn to the next slide. So before you is a picture of a tree with branches and limbs and a trunk. And above it are these words, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. The full lyrics for the jazz composition, that is to say, Strange Fruit, which was sung by Billie Holiday, an African-American jazz musician, and composed by the Jewish-American teacher Abel Marable. These words, of course, southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. This iconic American jazz composition, Strange Fruit, is here rendered as a tree, which represents racial harms. The trunk of the tree, you see the categories that we've described in terms of housing and education and health, but they extend upward into federal policies and practice. If you notice that the trees and branches interact with one another. Below the trunk is, of course, the roots of the tree, which go back into chattel slavery. What's important about this is it makes clear that when we talk about reparations and reparatory justice, we're not merely talking about the roots, we're also talking about the trunk, we're also talking about the branches, we're also talking about the limbs, we're talking about the ways in which these things interact. If we can go to the next slide. And so very quickly, I just want to lift up a few historical examples of reparations, talk very briefly about religious norms and the norms in human rights instruments and examples. So when we think about